The brass nameplate on my office door was gone. It hadn't been unscrewed. The wood was scarred where a screwdriver had slipped, leaving a pale, jagged gouge in the mahogany. In its place was a sticky residue of adhesive and a faint, rectangular shadow of the person I used to be in this building. I stood in the hallway of Ravell Associates, listening to the hum of the HVAC system, and felt the first true click of the mechanism. Most people think rage is hot. They're wrong. True rage is a refrigerated room. It's a ledger where every slight is recorded in precise black ink. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I walked past the open plan desks toward the corner office. Sarah, a junior researcher who usually greeted me with a caffeinated "Good morning, Drew," didn't look up. She was intensely focused on a spreadsheet that appeared to be empty. The air in the office felt thick, the way it does before a massive storm, where the birds go silent and the sky turns a bruised shade of violet. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my father's office. Holden Ravell sat behind a desk that cost more than my first 3 years of salary. He didn't look up. He was reading a physical copy of the Sunday Times, the paper crinkling with a sound like dry leaves. To his left, sitting in one of the guest chairs with her legs crossed and a tablet balanced on her knee, was Ayla. My sister looked immaculate. Her hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead smooth, erasing any hint of the manipulation she'd been practicing since we were children. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer that screamed neutral party, though she was anything but. "You're late, Drew," Holden said, still not looking up from the paper. "The nameplate is missing," I said. I didn't sit down. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my hands loose at my sides. The janitorial staff usually doesn't prune the signage unless there's a shift in the organizational chart. Holden finally folded the paper. His face was a map of professional discipline, a mask he had perfected over 40 years of burying rivals and managing narratives. "There is a shift. We're moving you off the Henderson account, effective immediately." The Henderson account was my 3-year investment. It was the investigative series that was going to put this agency on the national map, moving us from a local PR firm to a serious journalistic powerhouse. I had the documents, I had the sources. "And who takes the lead?" I asked, though I already knew. Ayla cleared her throat, a soft musical sound. The board felt, and Dad agreed, that the tone needed a softer touch. More community outreach, less interrogation. "I've already reached out to the Henderson stakeholders. We're pivoting to a partnership model." "A partnership model," I repeated. I looked at her. She gave me a small, practiced smile, the one she used for donors and people she was about to fire. It was a smile that expected me to fold. It was a smile that assumed I was a known variable. "You're burying the lead because the lead is inconvenient for their stock price." "We are protecting the agency," Holden snapped. He leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing. "You've become a liability, Drew. Too aggressive, too personal. Ayla has shown the kind of restraint you seem to lack. Now, before we discuss your new role in the archives department, there is the matter of the memo you sent to Ayla's team last night." "The one where I pointed out her data was falsified?" Ayla's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened on the edge of her tablet. "It was a difference of interpretation, Drew, but your language was unprofessional. It created a hostile environment." Holden stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his height like a blunt instrument. "You will issue a formal, written apology to your sister. You will CC the entire department, and you will do it by 5 o'clock today. If you don't, we'll consider your position here untenable." I looked at Holden. Then I looked at Ayla. She was watching me, her eyes bright with the thrill of the squeeze. She wanted to see me break. She wanted the public submission because in this family, the one who apologizes is the one who loses the right to speak. "Fine," I said. The word was small. It was a pebble dropped into a deep well. Ayla's eyebrows shot up. She hadn't expected it to be that easy. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to scream so she could look like the rational one. "Fine?" she echoed. "Fine," I said again, my voice flat and devoid of the sarcasm I was feeling. "I'll give you exactly what you're looking for." I turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. Slams are for people who still think noise equals power. I went back to my desk, or what used to be my desk. I sat down and looked at the screen. My access to the Henderson folders had already been revoked. I tried to log into the internal server, and a red dialog box popped up. "Access denied. Contact administrator." They were fast. I'll give them that. They had spent the weekend cordoning me off like a contaminated site. I leaned back and looked at the office. It was a hive of quiet betrayals. In the cubicle across from me, Marcus, a guy I had mentored for 2 years, was pointedly looking at his monitor, his shoulders hunched. He knew. Everyone knew. I was the sacrificial lamb offered up to ensure the Henderson contract stayed lucrative. I pulled a single sheet of heavy bond paper from my drawer. I didn't use the agency letterhead. I began to type, but I didn't type an apology. I typed a formal resignation. I made it clinical. I cited the realignment of company values as my primary reason for departure. I ensured that every sentence was a masterpiece of legal protection. I wasn't quitting because I was angry. I was quitting because the agency had breached the ethical standards outlined in my personal contract, a contract Holden had signed 5 years ago without reading the fine print I'd inserted regarding editorial independence. As the printer whirred to life in the corner, I began to clear my desk. I didn't have much: a leather-bound notebook, a fountain pen my grandfather had given me, a digital recorder. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Ayla. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and sharp, like citrus and iron. The apology, Drew. Dad wants it sent soon. He's worried you'll lose your nerve. I kept stacking my notebooks. I'm working on it, Ayla. It's going to be a very thorough statement. Good, she said. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't reach the other desks. Don't take it so hard. You were always better at the research anyway. Let me handle the optics. I'm better at people. You're just better at files. You're right, I said, finally turning to face her. I gave her a look of pure, unadulterated defeat. I let my shoulders sag. I let my eyes lose their focus. I played the part of the beaten dog perfectly. I am much better at files. She patted my arm. The touch made my skin crawl, but I didn't flinch. I'll see you at the staff meeting at 4. She walked away, her heels clicking a victory march on the hardwood. I waited until she was gone. Then I walked over to the printer. I picked up my resignation and a second set of documents I had printed earlier that morning from my home computer, documents I had been compiling for months, ever since I noticed the discrepancies in the agency's tax filings and client gift logs. I went back to my desk and opened the agency's client pipeline on the common drive. They hadn't cut my access to the general business leads yet, only my specific projects. It was a tactical error. They assumed I only cared about the work I was doing, not the work they were planning. Alden, I scrolled through the upcoming contracts. My eyes stopped on a name, Vanguard Urban Development. Vanguard was the biggest developer in the state. They were also the primary reason the Henderson investigation existed. According to the pipeline, Ravell Associates wasn't just representing a community partner of Vanguard. They were being retained by Vanguard directly to manage the narrative of the very investigation I had been leading. Holden hadn't just benched me. He had sold my research to the target so they could see what I had on them. He had turned my own work into a roadmap for their defense. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. This wasn't just a family spat. This was a liquidation. They were selling me off to protect the firm's bottom line. I took a thumb drive from my pocket. It was a small, black plastic thing. It looked like nothing. I plugged it in and began a mirrored download of the pipeline. I wasn't stealing trade secrets. I was reclaiming my own intellectual property, as permitted by the proprietary work clause in my specific employment agreement. Holden had always told me to be a meticulous journalist. It was a shame he never realized I applied that same scrutiny to him. As the progress bar crept toward 100%, I looked at the clock. 11:45 a.m. I stood up, tucked my single box of belongings under my arm, and placed the resignation letter face down on my keyboard. On my way out, I stopped by the office manager's desk. "Hey, Beth," I said. She looked up, startled. "Drew, are you going to lunch?" "In a way," I said. "Could you make sure Holden gets the file on my desk? He's expecting a statement from me. I think he'll find it very clarifying." "Sure, Drew. Are you okay? You look different." "I feel great, Beth," I said, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a lie. I finally stopped trying to fit into a room that was designed to shrink me. I walked out of the glass doors of Ravell Associates. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what the office would look like in 20 minutes when Ayla walked in, expecting to find me hunched over my keyboard, typing out a groveling plea for forgiveness. She would find an empty chair. She would find a desk so clean it looked like I had never existed. And she would find a resignation that stripped her of her legal right to use any of my Henderson research for her partnership model. I reached my car and sat in the silence of the parking garage. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Ayla. "Don't be late for the meeting. Dad is in a mood." I deleted the thread. I pulled out of the garage and into the bright, unforgiving midday sun. As I drove toward the city library, I thought about the detail I'd found in the pipeline. Vanguard wasn't just a client. They were a creditor. My father's agency didn't just work for them, they owed them, and I was the only one who knew where the collateral was buried. I felt the weight of the thumb drive in my pocket. It was the only thing I had left of my family's legacy. It was more than enough. The revenge wouldn't be a scream. It would be a slow, methodical erasure. I was going to take everything they thought they had stolen from me and turn it into a ghost story. I pulled into a spot, ruined the engine, and opened my laptop. I had a lot of phone calls to make, and none of them were to my father. The silence of the early morning office was the most honest thing about Ravell Associates. At 6:15 a.m., the air was devoid of the manufactured charm and the performative hustle that usually defined the space. The blue light of pre-dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the workstations. I stood by the industrial-sized shredder in the corner, listening to the rhythmic whir of paper being reduced to confetti. I wasn't destroying evidence, I was destroying the tether. Every document I fed into the machine was a duplicate of a project I had already secured on an external server. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, there wouldn't be a single scrap of my creative energy left in this building that wasn't legally tied to my personal entity. I walked back to my desk one last time. It was a vacuum. I had wiped the surface with a microfiber cloth until the wood gleamed with a sterile, impersonal shine. No pens, no sticky notes, no half-empty coffee mugs. To an outsider, it looked like a new hire was expected. To my family, it would look like a crime scene where the only thing missing was the body. I placed the final resignation folder, the one containing the non-compete waiver I had tricked Holden into signing 3 years ago during a routine contract update, directly in the center of the desk. I sat in my chair, feeling the familiar tilt of the lumbar support. I thought about the many nights I'd spent here, fueled by the delusion that if I worked harder than Ayla, if I dug deeper than the other investigators, Holden would eventually see me as a partner rather than a tool. It was a common psychological trap, the belief that merit could overcome a fixed hierarchy. But hierarchies don't care about merit, they care about maintenance. And I was no longer interested in maintaining the Ravell legacy. The elevator chimed at the end of the hall. It was too early for the general staff. This was the arrival of the inner circle. I didn't move. I wanted to see the transition. Ayla stepped off the elevator first. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal gray suit that telegraphed authority. She was holding 2 coffees, likely a peace offering or a tactical bribe for the conversation she thought we were about to have. She was humming a soft tune, her steps light and confident. She didn't notice me at first. She walked toward her own office, then paused, her gaze drifting toward my cubicle. She stopped, her head tilted to the side, a gesture that reminded me of a predatory bird spotting movement in the grass. She walked toward my desk, her brow furrowing. The humming stopped. She saw the empty drawers, the lack of a computer monitor, which I had packed into my trunk at 5 a.m., and finally, the white folder. "Drew," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. She hadn't seen me sitting in the shadow of the pillar near the break room. I stepped out into the light. "Good morning, Ayla." She jumped, nearly dropping the coffees. "What are you doing? Why is your desk? Where is your equipment?" "I've moved it," I said calmly. I walked toward her, my hands in my pockets. I didn't rush. I didn't show agitation. I was the personification of a closed account. "The equipment is company issued, so I've left it with the IT manager's overnight drop-off. The personal items are already gone." "What are you talking about? The meeting is at 9. You have to send that apology." She set the coffees down on a nearby table, her composure fracturing. "Dad is already on his way. You can't just clear your desk." "I can," I said, and I have. The folder on the desk is my formal resignation, effective immediately. It also contains the legal memorandum regarding the Henderson intellectual property. Since I brought that client to the firm under a special project carve-out, the rights to the research remain with the lead investigator. That's me. Ayla's face went from confusion to a pale, tight-lipped mask of fury. "You think you can just walk away with the Henderson files? That's agency property. We've already billed Vanguard for the preliminary audit." "Then you've billed them for work you no longer have the right to sell," I replied. I checked my watch. In approximately 10 minutes, my legal counsel will be serving Holden with a cease and desist regarding the use of my specific data sets. If you want to talk to the Hendersons, you'll have to do it without my notes, my sources, or my recorded interviews. The elevator chimed again. This time, it was Holden. He stepped out, looking every bit the patriarch, his coat draped over his arm. He saw us standing there, and his expression darkened. "Why are the lights still dimmed? Ayla, why aren't you in your office?" "Dad," Ayla said, her voice trembling slightly. He's leaving. He's trying to take Henderson with him. Holden's gaze snapped to me. He walked over, his presence filling the hallway like a physical weight. He didn't look at the empty desk. He looked at me, searching for the crack, the moment where I would flinch. You're making a mistake, Drew. A very expensive one. You think you can survive out there without the Ravell name? You're a freelancer with a grudge. Nobody hires a grudge. Actually, I said, leaning against the edge of the empty desk, they hire results. And since the Ravell name is currently attached to a conflict of interest involving Vanguard Urban Development, I think my name is going to be quite popular in about 48 hours. Holden's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't realized I'd found the Vanguard connection in the pipeline. You have no proof of anything. I have enough to start a conversation, I said. I'm leaving now. I've left the office keys and my ID badge in the folder. Everything is documented. Everything is clean. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. As I walked past them, Ayla reached out as if to grab my arm, but she stopped herself. Her smile had completely collapsed into a jagged line of resentment. She looked small in that oversized office, surrounded by the ghosts of my work. You'll crawl back, Holden called after me as I reached the elevator. Within a month, you'll be begging for a desk in the basement. Maybe, I said, the doors beginning to slide shut. But at least it'll be my desk. I spent the next 4 hours in a diner 3 blocks away, watching the entrance to the office building through the window. I saw the courier arrive. I saw the office manager, Beth, walk out to the sidewalk 20 minutes later, looking distressed and speaking rapidly into her phone. I saw the ripples of the stone I had thrown, and the water was becoming very, very choppy. My phone remained silent. I had blocked Holden and Ayla the moment I stepped onto the street. I wasn't interested in the shouting matches or the family first lectures. I was interested in the mechanics of the unraveling. Around noon, a message appeared on my secondary laptop. It was from a former client, a high-ranking executive at a tech firm I'd helped during a reputation crisis 2 years ago. Drew, just got a strange call from Ayla. She's claiming you've taken a sabbatical for health reasons and that she's taking over the project. But here's the thing. She's using the draft you sent me last week, only your name has been stripped from the metadata. Is everything okay? I stared at the screen. Ayla wasn't just trying to keep the clients. She was actively erasing my presence from the work I'd already delivered. She was reshaping the past in real time. It was a bold move, and an incredibly stupid one. She assumed I hadn't left digital breadcrumbs. She assumed I was playing by the rules of a game we had both already lost. I typed back, I'm no longer with the agency. The sabbatical is actually a resignation due to ethical concerns regarding the Vanguard account. Regarding the metadata, check the hidden watermarks in the 3rd paragraph of the executive summary. My digital signature is embedded in the punctuation. I hit send and felt a surge of cold, professional satisfaction. The betrayal hadn't started with the apology demand. It hadn't even started with the Henderson account. As I sat in that diner, scrolling through my own archived drafts and comparing them to the new agency portfolio Ayla had just pushed live on their website, I saw the pattern. My ideas, my phrasing, my investigative hooks, they had been systematically siphoned for months. I had been the ghostwriter for my own sister's rise to power. Holden hadn't just allowed it, he had architected it. He needed a polished face for the firm, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about where the Vanguard money was coming from. He needed a workhorse in the back and a show pony in the front. I looked at my reflection in the darkened screen of the laptop. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who had finally stopped trying to win a race and decided to just remove the track. The diner was filling up with the lunch crowd, men in suits, women in sensible heels, all of them moving within the systems they believed would protect them. They believed in the contracts. They believed in the names on the doors. I stood up, left a generous tip, and walked out into the humid afternoon air. The city felt different now. It wasn't a playground or a workplace. It was a grid of vulnerabilities. Every office building I passed contained a secret. Every person I saw had a price. I headed toward the parking garage where I'd left my car. As I reached the 3rd level, a black sedan pulled up, blocking the exit to my row. The tinted window rolled down halfway. It wasn't Holden. It was a man I recognized from the agency's security detail, a consultant Holden hired for the more sensitive physical aspects of investigative work. Mr. Ravell wants to have a word, Drew, off the record. Tell him the record is the only thing I have left, I said, not stopping. I walked around the car, my heart rate steady. And tell him if he wants to talk, he can do it through the legal channels I've provided, or he can wait for the morning edition of the Ledger. I hear they're very interested in the Vanguard Ravell partnership. The man didn't move. He just watched me. He's not going to let this go, kid. I know. I said, reaching my car and unlocking the door. That's the whole point. I drove out of the garage, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I wasn't being followed, not yet, but the pressure was building. I could feel the agency's resources being mobilized against me. The quiet phone calls to editors, the subtle hints to vendors that my credit was no longer good, the slow-motion blacklisting that happens to people who break the family code. I pulled over near a public park and opened my phone to a secure messaging app. I had one more message to send before the day was over. It was to the one person at the agency who knew exactly how much Ayla had stolen and exactly how much Holden was hiding. The desk is empty, Marcus. The door is open. Do you want to stay in the shadows, or do you want to see what happens when the lights come on? I waited. 1 minute. 2. The reply came back with a single attachment, a PDF of a secret ledger Holden kept in a private safe. Show them everything, the message read. I smiled. The unraveling was no longer a plan. It was an avalanche. The transition from a corner office with a view of the skyline to a corner table at a 24-hour diner with a view of a grease trap should have felt like a defeat. Instead, it felt like an upgrade in clarity. The air in Ravell Associates had been filtered and recycled until it tasted like artificial success. Out here, in the damp humidity of the city, the air tasted like carbon and opportunity. I sat with my laptop open, the screen's glow reflecting in my lukewarm coffee. I had been out for 48 hours, and already the narrative was shifting. I wasn't the journalist who had been benched. I was the journalist who had taken the ball and left the stadium. Rebuilding an independent operation is a lesson in social engineering. I spent the morning in public libraries and coffee shops, moving every 2 hours to avoid being a static target. My phone stayed in a signal shielding pouch, except for the 30-second windows I used to check messages. I was a ghost in the machine, and for the first time in my career, I was enjoying the haunting. The clients I had nurtured over the years, the ones Holden thought he owned by proxy, were proving to be more loyal to the person than the stationery. They knew who did the legwork. They knew whose voice was on the other end of the line at midnight when a crisis peaked. I met my first ally in a parking garage beneath the Civic Center. Elias was a former editor who had been pushed out of the industry by Holden's influence a decade ago. He was a man who understood the weight of a long memory. He stood by a concrete pillar, his trench coat smelling of old newsprint and cheap tobacco. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a manila envelope. Your sister is working the phones, Drew, Elias said, his voice a gravelly rasp. She's not just calling your clients. She's calling the publishers. She's telling them you're unwell. She's using that soft, concerned tone that makes people think you've had a breakdown. It's a classic play, I said, taking the envelope. If you can't discredit the work, discredit the worker. She's also trying to scrub the Vanguard connection. I have a contact at the city planning office. Ayla's been there twice this week, trying to pull the original filings you used for the Henderson piece. She's trying to rewrite the timeline so it looks like the firm found the corruption and mitigated it before you ever got involved. I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of visitor logs and internal memos. Ayla was moving fast, but she was moving with the desperation of someone trying to stop a leak with their bare hands. She was trying to frame herself as the whistleblower after the fact. It was a sophisticated betrayal, a way to keep the Vanguard money while appearing to be the hero of the Henderson story. She's late, I murmured. The betrayal started months ago. I've found the metadata footprints on her recent solo successes. She's been using my research drafts as her own since last autumn. Elias looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips. So, what's the move? You going to the press? Not yet. If I go to the press now, it's just a family feud. I need the dominoes to be perfectly aligned. I need the moment where her heroic narrative hits the reality of my documentation. I left Elias and headed toward the newsroom of a rival independent weekly. I needed to see if the blacklisting had reached the street level. As I walked, I noticed a silver sedan idling at the corner. It wasn't the security consultant from the agency. It was a nondescript vehicle, the kind a corporate investigator uses when they want to be seen just enough to cause anxiety. Holden was no longer just protecting the firm, he was tracking the asset. I didn't head for my car. Instead, I ducked into the transit hub, a sprawling labyrinth of glass, steel, and moving bodies. The afternoon rush was beginning. I moved with the crowd, my eyes scanning the reflections in the glass. The silver sedan had stayed at the curb, but a man in a navy windbreaker was now 50 paces behind me, moving with a practiced, steady gait. The pressure was a physical sensation, like a tightening in the chest, but I kept my breathing rhythmic. This was the first action scene of my new life. A high-stakes chess match played through the corridors of public infrastructure. I didn't need to run. I needed to outcalculate him. I turned into a crowded food court, weaving between tables and groups of tourists. I spotted a service hallway near the restrooms, a shortcut used by the cleaning staff. I slipped inside, the heavy door closing with a muffled thud. I moved quickly through the gray, concrete passage, the smell of industrial cleaner stinging my nostrils. I emerged 2 minutes later in a different wing of the station, near the taxi stand. I didn't take a cab. I took a bus, sitting in the back and watching the Navy windbreaker emerge from the main entrance, his head swiveling as he realized he'd lost the trail. I wasn't just a journalist anymore. I was a strategist. I spent the next 4 hours in the back of a public library, the kind with towering shelves and a silence so profound it felt like a shield. I used the library's hardwired computers to access the PDF Marcus had sent. The secret ledger was a masterpiece of corporate shadows. It wasn't just Vanguard. It was a network of shell companies all funneling consulting fees into Ravell Associates in exchange for narrative management. But then I saw it. A date from 6 months ago. An entry for a payment from a holding company linked to Vanguard, marked as Project Alpha Settlement. The amount was staggering, and the recipient wasn't the agency's main account. It was a private trust held in Ayla's name. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal hadn't been Holden's idea alone. Ayla had been the one to initiate the Vanguard partnership. She had bypassed our father's usual channels and set up her own revenue stream, using my investigation as the leverage. She had told Holden that I was the one who was compromised, that I was the one who couldn't be trusted with the Henderson files, all while she was cashing checks from the very people I was investigating. She hadn't just positioned me as expendable, she had used me as the currency for her own independence. I sat there, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and I felt the last of my hesitation vanish. I had been worried about the villain label. I had been worried about the moral cost of dismantling my father's life work. But they weren't building a legacy. They were running a scam, and I was the only person with the map to the vault. I began to plan the retaliation. It wouldn't be a messy public brawl. It would be a series of professional strikes that would strip away their credibility layer by layer. I started by drafting a series of informational inquiries to the board of directors of the agency's top 5 clients. I didn't make accusations. I simply asked for clarification on their conflict of interest policies regarding third-party trusts and narrative management services. I was planting the seeds of doubt. In the world of high-stakes media, doubt is as effective as a fire. Once it starts, everyone moves to save their own reputation first. As the library prepared to close, I packed my things. I felt a strange, cold peace. I was no longer the underdog trying to reclaim a seat at a table that didn't want me. I was the one who was going to take the table apart and use the wood for something else. I walked out into the evening air. The city was glowing now, the streetlights humming with electric life. I headed toward a small, secure storage unit I had rented under a pseudonym. I needed to store the hard copies I had gathered. As I approached the facility, my phone buzzed in the shielding pouch. I pulled it out. A message from an unknown number. Just a photo. It was a picture of the diner where I had been sitting that morning. The table where I had been working was empty, but there was a single item sitting on the surface. My old nameplate from the office. The one with the gouge in the wood. The message followed a second later. We know you're still in the city, Drew. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Come home and let's fix this before the board meets on Monday. It was from Holden. Not a threat, but a command wrapped in the guise of paternal concern. He still thought he could manage me. He still thought I was a component that could be repaired and put back into the machine. I looked at the nameplate in the photo. It was a relic of a person who no longer existed. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a photo of the library's trash can, filled with discarded newspapers and coffee cups, and sent it back. I walked into the storage facility, the metal door rattling as I slid it shut. I sat on a plastic crate in the dim light of a single bulb and began to organize the final phase. The Henderson files, the Vanguard ledger, the metadata from Ayla's stolen work. It was all here. I realized then that the betrayal started even earlier than the apology. It started the moment Holden realized Ayla was more like him than I was. She was the heir he wanted, ruthless, optics-obsessed, and willing to sell the truth for the right price. I was just the inconvenient conscience they had to keep in the dark. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Monday was 3 days away. I had 72 hours to ensure that when the board met, they wouldn't be discussing my sabbatical. They would be discussing the legal dissolution of Ravell Associates. I stood up, feeling a sudden burst of energy. I wasn't tired. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. The city was still awake, and I had work to do. My name was still on people's lips, but by the time I was finished, it wouldn't be a name associated with a family. It would be a name associated with the end of a dynasty. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would win. The cliffhanger was whether there would be anything left of Ayla's polished world by the time the sun came up on Monday. I walked out of the unit, locked the door, and disappeared into the shadows of the alleyway, moving toward the next move on the board. The storage unit was a concrete cube of archived failures and forgotten triumphs. It smelled of damp cardboard and the metallic tang of the roll-up door. Under the harsh, buzzing hum of a single overhead bulb, I sat on a stack of plastic crates and began to reconstruct the timeline. I didn't use a computer for this. I used the floor. I laid out the physical documents, the printed emails, and the annotated drafts like a map of a battlefield. I was looking for the precise moment the floor had dropped away, and as the hours ticked past midnight, I realized the collapse hadn't been a sudden event. It was a slow, deliberate erosion. I had recruited Ben, a childhood friend who now worked as a forensic data analyst for a private security firm, to help me bypass the encryption on the agency's internal archives. We sat in the cramped space, the glow of his specialized laptop illuminating the sweat on his forehead. Ben didn't ask questions about why I was hiding in a storage facility or why I was dismantling my father's company. He only cared about the logic of the code. "You see this timestamp?" Ben pointed to a series of logs from 8 months ago. "This is a remote access ping to your workstation. It happened at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. Someone wasn't just looking at your files, Drew. They were mirroring your entire in-progress folder." I leaned in, my eyes stinging from the dry air. The IP address wasn't a mystery. It was the static address for the Ravell summer house, the place where Ayla had spent that entire month recuperating from a minor surgery. She hadn't been resting, she had been harvesting. Every interview I had conducted, every confidential source I had nurtured for the Henderson investigation had been funneled directly into her personal drive before I had even finished my first drafts. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. As I cross-referenced the dates, I saw that every time I had hit a roadblock in my research, a source suddenly going silent or a document request being denied, Ayla had been the one to, coincidentally, suggest a different angle. She hadn't been helping me. She had been steering me away from the Vanguard connections she was already selling. She had positioned me as the expendable shield. If the investigation blew up, I was the aggressive, unstable lead who had overstepped. If it succeeded, she had the mirrored files ready to claim as her own. "It gets worse," Ben whispered, tapping a few more keys. "Look at the authorization logs for the Vanguard account setup. It wasn't just Ayla. The approval for the secret trust, the one receiving the consulting fees, was signed off by a master override code." "Holden," I said. My voice was a flat, hollow sound in the small room. "Yeah, but Drew, look at the date on the override. He didn't sign it after she set it up. He signed it 2 weeks before she even made the first contact with Vanguard. He didn't just know, he paved the way." The realization was a sharp, focused weight in my gut. This wasn't a case of a father being blinded by a favored daughter. This was a loyalty test. Holden had intentionally created a scenario where Ayla would betray me, and he had sat back to watch how I would react. He wanted to see if I would fold, if I would fight, or if I would be smart enough to see the trap. To him, the agency wasn't a family business. It was an apex predator's training ground. He had allowed Ayla to steal my work to see if she was ruthless enough to lead, and he had allowed me to be benched to see if I was disciplined enough to remain a silent, useful tool. I stood up and paced the small perimeter of the unit. The air felt thin. Everything I had believed about the family-first motto Holden preached was a fabrication. We weren't a family. We were a case study in controlled conflict. "I need to confront them," I said, mostly to myself. "Legal confrontation?" Ben asked, not looking up from the screen. "No, that's too slow. They expect a lawsuit. They've already budgeted for it. I need to strike at the optics. I need to show them that I'm not just a researcher they can mirror. I'm the one who owns the narrative." I left Ben in the storage unit and drove toward the agency's satellite office, a small glass-fronted suite in the financial district that Ayla used for private client consultations. I knew she was there. Her social media had boasted about a late-night strategy session with an anonymous partner. I knew that partner was the lead counsel for Vanguard. I parked across the street and watched. The building was a tower of light and shadow. I didn't want a physical altercation. I wanted a demonstration of reach. I pulled out my phone and accessed the building's digital directory. It was a standard system, one I had helped the agency's security team audit a year ago. I knew the back door. Within minutes, I had bypassed the lobby's display controls. Instead of the rotating list of corporate tenants, the large screens in the windows began to display a single looping image. The Vanguard Ravell Project Alpha ledger, with a trust payment to Ayla highlighted in bright neon red. It was a silent, public accusation, visible to every late-night commuter and security patrol on the block. I watched from the shadows as the lobby security guards scrambled, pointing at the screens and talking frantically into their radios. A minute later, Ayla emerged from the elevator. She looked panicked, her polished exterior beginning to crack. She saw the screen, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked around the street, her eyes searching the parked cars, searching for me. I stayed in the darkness, watching her realize that her secret was now a public broadcast. This was the second action, a tactical sabotage of her status. I wasn't just taking my work back, I was making her brand radioactive. I drove away before the police arrived to reset the system. The high-tension confrontation hadn't required a single word. The property damage was non-existent, just a few lines of code and a very public embarrassment, but the message was irreversible. I returned to the storage unit, where Ben was packing up. He looked at me with a mix of respect and unease. "You're really doing this, aren't you? You're going to take the whole thing down." "They started it 8 months ago," I said. "I'm just finishing the cycle." After Ben left, I sat alone in the silence. I pulled out a final set of papers I had hidden at the bottom of a box of old tax returns. These weren't digital. They were handwritten notes from my mother, written shortly before she left Holden and moved across the country. She had warned me, even then, that Holden viewed people as investments rather than individuals. She had seen the trajectory of the agency long before I had. The twist wasn't that they were corrupt. The twist was that the corruption was the point. Holden hadn't benched me because I was aggressive. He had benched me because I was the only thing left in the agency that he couldn't fully quantify. I was the variable he couldn't control with a paycheck or a title. I realized then that my plan to expose them wasn't enough. Exposure is just a headline that fades by the next news cycle. I needed something permanent. I needed to ensure that when the dust settled, the Ravell name wasn't just tarnished. It was a liability that no one would touch. I began to draft the final exposure. It wouldn't be a blog post or a leak to a rival paper. It would be a coordinated release to the very regulatory bodies that oversaw Vanguard's development permits. I would use the agency's own documentation to prove that the narrative management they were providing was actually a form of unlicensed lobbying and witness interference. I worked through the rest of the night, my fingers flying across the keys. I felt a strange, cold detachment. The anger had crystallized into a professional objective. I wasn't Drew Holden, the disgruntled son. I was Drew Holden, the strategist who was about to execute a hostile takeover of his own legacy. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the industrial park, I sent a single email to Holden's private account. No subject line. Just a link to the regulatory filing I was about to submit, and a timer set for the opening of the stock market on Monday morning. I walked out of the storage unit and stood in the cool morning air. I felt the weight of the last few days settling into my bones, but I didn't feel tired. I felt ready. The long-term manipulation was over. The tests were finished. I had passed the only test that mattered. I had stopped being a victim and started being a villain. The final realization hit me as I looked at my reflection in the car window. I wasn't reclaiming my seat at the table. I was the one who was going to walk away while the table burned, and I wouldn't look back to see who was still sitting there. The city was waking up, and by the time the sun set, the name Ravell would mean something entirely different. I reached for my phone and made one last call. Not to a lawyer, not to a friend, to the influential third-party observer who would be hosting the industry gala on Sunday night. The person who could give me the platform I needed for the final turn. "I have a story for you," I said when he answered, "and it's the kind of story that changes everything." I hung up before he could ask a question. The board was set. The pieces were moving, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the clock. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a cathedral of manufactured prestige. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the gilded ceiling, casting a fractured, shimmering light over 500 of the most influential players in American media. The air was a cocktail of expensive cologne, cedarwood, and the sharp, metallic tang of ambition. This was the annual Media Integrity Gala, the very event where, 48 hours ago, Ravell Associates had planned to announce their strategic partnership with Vanguard Urban Development. It was supposed to be Ayla's coronation. Instead, I had arrived to ensure it was an autopsy. I stood in the balcony shadows, adjusted my cufflinks, and watched the room. I wasn't wearing a tuxedo, I was wearing a suit of dark charcoal armor. Down on the floor, I could see Holden. He moved through the crowd like a shark in a tuxedo, his presence parting the sea of junior executives. He was shaking hands, his face fixed in that statesman-like mask that suggested he was the guardian of the industry's soul. Ayla was by his side, radiant in a gown of shimmering silver that made her look like a blade. She was laughing at a joke made by Julian Vane, the most powerful media mogul on the East Coast. She looked untouchable. I felt a surge of cold, clinical detachment. I didn't hate them anymore. You don't hate a virus, you simply neutralize it. I had spent the last 3 hours coordinating with the AV technicians, not through the front door, but through the back-end server access I'd maintained via a legacy administrative account. The technicians thought they were preparing a tribute video for Holden's Lifetime Achievement Award. They were partially correct. I moved down the back stairs, my footsteps silent on the plush carpeting. I didn't head for the main floor. I headed for the staging area behind the massive LED screen that dominated the ballroom. I checked my watch. 8:14 p.m. In 6 minutes, Holden would be invited to the stage. As I navigated the forest of cables and equipment, I ran into Marcus. He was holding a clipboard, his face a pale mask of anxiety. He had been assigned to handle the transition materials for the Ravell presentation. When he saw me, he froze, his eyes darting toward the security guards at the door. "Drew, you shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Holden has guards on every entrance. He told them you were a security risk. He said you were unstable." "I am the most stable person in this room, Marcus," I said, stepping into his space. I didn't threaten him. I simply stood with the weight of someone who already knew the outcome. "Did you bring the drive?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers trembling on the edge of his clipboard. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, encrypted device I had asked for. "The final contracts are on there, the ones Holden signed this afternoon with Vanguard. He's selling the entire Henderson archive to their legal defense team for a consulting fee of $4 million. I took the drive. "You did the right thing, Marcus. In an hour, being associated with Holden Ravell will be the most dangerous thing you can do for your career. Go home. Don't be in the room when the lights come on." He didn't wait for a second invitation. He turned and vanished into the service hallway. I was alone with the machinery. I plugged the drive into the master control console and began the upload. I wasn't just replacing a video, I was layering a narrative. Layer 1. The tribute video would begin normally. Layer 2. At the 3-minute mark, the audio would shift from orchestral swells to a recorded conversation between Ayla and the Vanguard CEO, a recording I had obtained from the digital archives she thought she'd purged. Layer 3. The visual would transition from photos of Holden's career to the Project Alpha ledger, showing the trust payments to Ayla's account, followed by the signed contract Marcus had just given me. This was the turn. I was no longer an investigator. I was the architect of an irreversible status collapse. I walked out from behind the screen and onto the main floor just as the master of ceremonies began his introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, a man who needs no introduction, a titan of truth and the cornerstone of Ravell Associates, Holden Ravell." The room erupted in applause. I stood at the very back, leaning against a marble pillar, my arms crossed. Holden stepped onto the stage, the spotlight catching the silver at his temples. He looked magnificent. He took the microphone, waited for the silence to settle, and began his prepared remarks about the sanctity of the narrative. "In our business," Holden said, his voice resonant and authoritative, "the truth is not just a commodity, it is a trust. And at Ravell Associates, we have always treated that trust as sacred." On cue, the screen behind him flickered to life. The tribute video began. It showed Holden as a young reporter, then the founding of the agency. The crowd watched, mesmerized by the myth-making. I looked at Ayla. She was standing near the front of the stage, her chin tilted up, soaking in the reflected glory. Then the audio shifted. Ayla's voice, sharp and unmistakable, filled the ballroom. "We can bury the Henderson report under a community outreach initiative. Drew is already being marginalized. By the time he realizes the data is gone, the Vanguard permits will be approved. We just need the final payment in the trust by Monday." The silence that followed was more profound than any applause. It was a vacuum of shock. Holden stopped speaking. He didn't turn around immediately. He stayed frozen, facing the audience, as the screen behind him displayed the Project Alpha ledger in towering, 20-foot-high letters. I began to walk down the center aisle. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence that drew every eye in the room. Ayla saw me first. Her face went from triumph to a hollow, gray terror. She looked at the screen, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. Holden finally turned. He looked at the evidence of his own daughter's betrayal and his own complicity, rendered in high definition for the 500 people who controlled his reputation. "Drew," Holden said into the microphone, his voice amplified and distorted, "stop this. This is a fabrication, a disgruntled employee's fantasy." "It's not a fantasy, Holden," I said, my voice projected by the sheer silence of the room. I reached the front of the stage. I didn't climb up. I stood below him, looking up. It's documentation. Every slide on that screen is backed by a filing I submitted to the State Ethics Commission and the Attorney General's office 20 minutes ago. The trust accounts, the mirrored servers, the sale of protected research, it's all there. The room was no longer a gala. It was a court of public opinion, and the verdict was already written on the faces of the guests. Julian Vane was already on his phone, likely instructing his newsrooms to lead with the scandal. The strategic partners were backing away from the Ravell table as if it were on fire. Holden looked down at me. For a second, the mask slipped. I didn't see rage. I saw a profound, chilling recognition. He realized that I hadn't just benched him. I had used the very tools he taught me, the social engineering, the long memory, the tactical timing, to erase him. "You've destroyed everything," he whispered, the microphone still catching the words. "No," I said. "I've just corrected the record. You told me to apologize for being unprofessional. I think this is the most professional thing I've ever done." I turned to Ayla. She was trembling, her hand gripping the edge of the podium. "The silver looks good on you, Ayla. It matches the coldness of the files you stole. But you forgot the most important rule of research. Always check the metadata. Your signature is on every single unauthorized transfer." I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I didn't need one. The reputation dominoes were falling in a perfect geometric progression. I turned my back on the stage and walked toward the exit. As I reached the heavy oak doors, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a senior partner from one of the rival firms, a man who had been Holden's competitor for 30 years. "That was thorough, Drew," the man said, his eyes scanning me with a new, wary respect. "What happens to the agency now?" "The agency is a name on a lease," I said, and the lease just expired. I walked out of the plaza and into the cool night air. I felt a strange, humming vibration in my chest, not of excitement, but of completion. I had crossed the line. I had become the villain in their story, the one who tore down the family temple to build something of my own. I wasn't the son anymore. I wasn't the brother. I was the strategist who had won. I checked my phone. The first news alerts were already hitting the wire. Ravell scandal. Whistleblower exposes Vanguard collusion at industry gala. I sat on a stone bench in Central Park, watching the city lights. I knew what would happen next. There would be investigations, a flurry of legal filings, and the slow, agonizing bankruptcy of Ravell Associates. Ayla would spend years in depositions. Holden would disappear into a bitter, silent retirement. But I wouldn't be there to see it. I had no interest in the aftermath. I had no interest in the healing. I had achieved the peak moment of revenge, the exact second where they realized they had lost, and that I was the one who had taken it from them. I stood up and started walking. I had a new office to scout tomorrow, a new name to put on a new plate. And this time, there wouldn't be any gouges in the wood. The morning air in the office was stagnant, a stark contrast to the electric hum of the city streets 40 floors below. It had been exactly 7 days since I walked out, and the return trip felt like a descent into a tomb that hadn't quite realized it was occupied. The glass doors were unlocked, a sign of the administrative collapse that had followed the gala. There was no receptionist, there were no "Good morning, Drew" greetings. The agency was a skeleton of polished chrome and expensive art, its pulse slowed to a terminal rhythm. I walked toward the central hub, the sound of my shoes on the hardwood floor echoing like a countdown. I wasn't here to pack, I wasn't here to talk. I was here to witness the finality of the logic I had set in motion. I found them in Holden's office. The door was wide open, as if the concept of privacy had become obsolete. Holden was sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't reading the paper. He was staring at a stack of legal notices that had been delivered by courier an hour ago. He looked aged, the sharp lines of his face having surrendered to a heavy, sagging gravity. Ayla was by the window, her back to the room. She was clutching a phone that wasn't ringing. Her silver dress from the gala had been replaced by a stiff black suit, but the poise was gone. She looked like a statue that had been shattered and glued back together. I stepped into the room. I didn't announce myself. I simply stood there, a presence that couldn't be ignored. "The creditors are calling, Drew," Holden said. His voice was a dry rasp, stripped of its resonant authority. "Vanguard pulled the contract at 3 a.m. They're suing us for breach of confidentiality. The board has voted to dissolve the partnership. By noon, the locks will be changed." "I know," I said. I walked to the guest chair, the one Ayla had occupied when this started, and sat down. I crossed my legs, feeling the cool, calm certainty of a finished equation. I'm the one who provided Vanguard's legal team with the proof that Ayla was playing both sides. I told them she was planning to use their private data as leverage for her own firm. They didn't pull the contract because of the ethics. They pulled it because she became a liability to their bottom line. Ayla turned then. Her eyes were rimmed with a dull, flat exhaustion. "You didn't just expose us. You dismantled the entire bridge. There's nowhere for any of us to go." "There's nowhere for you to go," I corrected her. I pulled a small, slim document from my inner pocket and slid it across the mahogany desk. "This is a purchase agreement for the agency's physical assets, the client list, and the remaining investigative archives. It's a low-ball offer, Holden. Insulting, really. But it's the only one that includes an assumption of the firm's outstanding legal liabilities." Holden looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "You're buying us? With what? You don't have this kind of capital." "I have the backing of Julian Vane," I said. He was very impressed by the presentation at the gala. He likes people who can deliver a narrative with that much precision. He's providing the venture capital. I'm providing the management. "You want to run this place?" Ayla asked, a hysterical edge creeping into her voice. "After you burned it down?" "I'm not running this place," I said, leaning forward. "I'm liquidating the name. The Ravell Associates signage is being removed as we speak. The new firm is Holden Investigative. I'm keeping Marcus and a few of the researchers who haven't been compromised. But the two of you are barred from the premises. Your personal belongings have already been moved to the loading dock." The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. I watched Holden's hand tremble as he reached for a pen. He was a man who understood the finality of a signature. He had spent his life using them as weapons. Now he was using one to sign his own professional obituary. "You were always too patient, Drew," Holden whispered as he scrawled his name on the line. "I thought it was a weakness. I thought you were waiting for permission." "I wasn't waiting for permission," I said, taking the document back and checking the signature. "I was waiting for the moment where the damage would be irreversible. If I had struck earlier, you would have found a way to spin it. You would have found a way to survive. I needed the foundation to be completely hollowed out first." I stood up. The meeting was over. The revenge was complete. There were no tears, no shouting matches, no dramatic pleas for family loyalty. Those things required a shared emotional language that we had long since abandoned. We were just three professionals concluding a very ugly transaction. I walked out of the office and toward the main entrance. In the hallway, two workers in gray jumpsuits were already on ladders. They were using heat guns and scrapers to peel the brass lettering from the wall. Ravell was already gone, leaving only a faint, ghostly outline on the glass. Associates was being flaked away in jagged golden shards. I saw the silent coworker, the one who had watched the benching on my first day. He was standing by the elevators, holding a cardboard box. He looked at me, then at the workers on the ladders. He nodded, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement of the shift in power. "The Hendersons called," he said quietly. "They want to know if the investigation is back on." "Tell them it never stopped," I said. "Tell them we'll have the final report on their desks by tomorrow morning. And tell them the tone will be exactly as aggressive as the facts allow." I reached the elevator and pressed the button. As the doors began to slide shut, I saw Ayla emerge from Holden's office. She was carrying a small plastic bin of her things. She looked at me through the narrowing gap of the doors. She wasn't smiling anymore. There was no manipulation left in her eyes, only the realization of what it felt like to be on the other side of the glass. I didn't wave. I didn't offer a final sarcastic remark. I simply watched her disappear as the doors clicked shut. The elevator descended, the floor numbers flickering in a steady descending count. I felt the pressure change in my ears as I moved toward the street level. My phone buzzed. A news notification. "Holden acquires Ravell Assets in stunning turnover." I stepped out into the lobby. The air was different here, sharper, colder, filled with the roar of a city that didn't care about names or legacies, only results. I walked past the security desk where a new guard was already being briefed on the restricted access list. My name wasn't on it. I walked out onto the sidewalk and stopped. I looked up at the top floor of the building. The lights were still on, but they didn't look like a beacon anymore. They looked like a remnant. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old gouged nameplate I had recovered from the diner. I walked to the edge of the curb and dropped it into a deep metal trash bin. It hit the bottom with a hollow, final clang. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel redeemed. I felt like the person who had finally finished the job he was hired to do. I turned and walked into the crowd, my pace steady and my direction clear. The story didn't need an ending. The ending was the walk. The ending was the silence. The ending was the fact that when people looked at the skyline tonight, they would see a space where a dynasty used to be, and they would know exactly who had cleared the view. I crossed the street, disappearing into the sea of people moving toward their own objectives, and I never looked back.